and Dr./Major Bruce Goodmanson. These gentlemen helped deepen my knowledge and understanding of decision games tremendously. Eric is the most experienced Marine wargamer I know, probably the most experienced wargamer I know, period. But he's a career intelligence officer. He advocated for the use of wargames as tools to help study military history, maneuver warfare, and lots of other topics. He made me aware of many of the classic tabletop games like Advanced Squad Leader, and was even gracious enough to sell me some of his old wargaming titles, which I still have. So thank you, Eric. Bruce Goodmanson, one of the world's leading military historians, took me under his wing and helped expand my understanding of not only military history, but tactical decision games and other kinds of decision-making exercises. In fact, as I was a pretty zealous college student, and Eric can probably attest to this as well, I'd email Bruce just about every day, asking him lots of questions, which he almost always answered. I said almost always because on some days, you know, he had a life. He was busy writing military history and teaching. He might only answer one of the 3 or 5 questions that I posed for him that day. But we carried on like this for most of my college experience, and I really can't say enough how much both Bruce and Eric influenced me. So how did I get into this business? So in 2009, as I was getting ready to graduate from the University of Arizona, I got my big break, thanks largely to Bruce. So he told me that there was an opening with Marine Corps University Foundation. It's a nonprofit that principally serves Marine Corps University down in Quantico, Virginia. The position was for a writer of decision forcing cases, or DFCs. I'll use that acronym throughout, and I'll also explain what it is in a bit. He asked if I was interested in the position. I said, absolutely. When do I interview? And his response, to my surprise, was, you've already interviewed. That's what all those questions and emails over these past few years have been. So little did I know I was kind of preparing for this job. It was by far the easiest job interview I've ever had because I got to ask all the questions. So I always thought that was kind of funny. But my position as a case writer was part of a modestly funded effort called the Case Method Project, which Bruce led. And the goal of our 2-man operation, which would grow to more people in the coming years, was to institutionalize DFCs in the learning culture of the Marine Corps. Certainly no small feat. So my work was project-based and not tethered to any specific location, so I could work remotely, which was a really, really great advantage of doing this stuff. So that meant when the first opportunity came for me to leave Tucson, I took it. That came not too long after getting my bachelor's degree in 2009. So I continued writing cases and then was given an opportunity to join Bruce in Carlisle, Pennsylvania for a year, where he was teaching DFC-based courses at the Army War College and Dickinson College. During this time, I would attend and participate in Bruce's classes at the War College. The students included, and I thought this was kind of interesting, the students included mostly colonels from other countries. It wasn't American students. It seemed a lot of, Bruce is a very cosmopolitan person, speaks multiple languages, has traveled all over the world. So he seemed to attract a lot of the foreign officers. So we had, I think we had maybe, in the 2 classes he taught, no more than 3 Americans in each class. They were mostly from Germany, Norway, Iraq. He's now I think a major general in the Iraqi army, but he was then a colonel sitting next to me. We had folks from Yemen, Kenya, Kazakhstan, and elsewhere. So very cosmopolitan group. I also attended Bruce's classes at Dickinson College, which were great because I got to see cases that had just been taught to a group of international colonels now put in front of American college students. I even got to teach my very own first case called What Now, Lieutenant? To the students at Dickinson, which was a phenomenal experience. And I think just last week was my anniversary, maybe 10-year anniversary or thereabouts of teaching that case. So that was a big deal. While in Carlisle, I became a junior fellow for the Case Method Project, and my job was just to observe, learn, and help produce cases. So I consider this period a major part of my apprenticeship in decision games. Here I was getting to learn from a world-class military historian and guru in decision game facilitation and design. Once our time at the War College ended, I got another great opportunity, this time to facilitate DFCs with Bruce to Marine staff non-commissioned officers who were attending the Faculty Advisors course at the, now it's called the College of Enlisted Professional Military Education, but back then it was called the Enlisted Professional Military Education in Quantico. So this gave me the chance to get comfortable teaching Marines, learn about Marine Corps culture, and get a sense, and you know, if you're trying to learn about Marine Corps culture, staff NCOs are a good place to start. And also get a sense of how decision games could be used in enlisted education. I had seen cases taught with colonels, I'd seen them taught with undergrads, and now I'm seeing them taught to staff sergeants, gunnery sergeants, and so on. By the way, as time went on, I realized that, at least in my experience, you could use the same case with just about any audience. In fact, I've taught the same DFCs to general officers, then privates first class, then civilians, and actually gotten very similar solutions, which I've always found interesting. Some answers may have had more nuance or used proper military terminology, but the essence of the solutions were often the same. So as our work with Faculty Advisors course continued, Bruce and I began working with other nearby schools and courses in Quantico. We taught several DFCs at the Infantry Officer course, IOC, at the bottom right of the screen, as well as the basic school, TBS, to the left. I'll be using IOC and TBS as acronyms, to interested faculty. So IOC asked if we could help build them some DFCs for some of their classes, and Bruce put me on the job. And as for my second big break, I think this was it. I'd never been a Marine. I'd never been in combat. And here I was being asked to develop a decision-making exercise for the Marine Corps' prestigious school for infantry officers. So believe me, my head was spinning. After assisting IOC, the commanding officer of the basic school, then Colonel, now Major General Dale Alford, requested that we have someone from our team on site at TBS to help institutionalize DFCs at his school. So I got the gig, and in late 2011 went to work in what's known as the bullpen. So the bullpen is this large open air office where the school's 40 or so captain instructors worked when they weren't teaching lieutenants. I was the only civilian in the room, and I kind of looked like this. Hair was a lot less long than it is now. This is due to COVID-19, but I had a beard and I looked like this. So you can imagine what that experience was like. And it was incredible, actually. I got to teach the staff. I got to work closely with the staff, co-facilitate things. I worked with the students. I worked closely with the captains, many of whom were veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I was initially asked to stay for 6 months, and that turned into 4 years. Because of my background in history and research skills, I was asked to help on other projects as well, both decision game and non-decision game related. So this resulted in a lot of fun challenges. For instance, I was asked to help organize and lead decision forcing staff rides, which we'll talk about later, to battlefields near Quantico, like Brandy Station, Chancellorsville, and Manassas. I also got to develop and regularly teach a class on the value of military history to all student classes. So every student company, which is about 250 to 300 lieutenants, would come through and get this class for me, where I was trying to impress upon them the value and benefit of military history and how they could use it. I also got to help with developing the school's internal professional military education program by bringing in guest speakers like Israeli military historian Dr. Martin Van Creveld, former CENTCOM Commander General Anthony Zinni, and prize-winning journalist and author Tom Ricks. So I learned so much during these years, and I think really started to come into my own as a DFC developer and facilitator. I had as many opportunities to teach as I wanted. I took as many of those opportunities as I could. At times, I would call it marathon teaching. I would try to set up as many cases as my schedule would allow and just go back to back to back, because I just absolutely loved engaging with both the captains and the lieutenants. Just amazing people. And I helped to create DFCs for both the basic officer course and warrant basic officer course on subjects like tactical planning, night operations, combat ethics, and others. And getting to work with hundreds of captains and thousands of lieutenants was an experience I can barely I think, accurately described. I learned so much about leadership and teaching styles, and even went to the field to see how all that classroom work with decision games translated to the real world in things like force-on-force exercises. So again, I don't say all of this to say, look at my resume, but just that I've been really extremely fortunate in my career trajectory. In fact, my years at TBS opened up so many other opportunities and offered countless learning experiences. Funny enough, I would not be here talking with you tonight if it weren't for my time at that school. I met my current boss at my work, Cognitive Performance Group, while she was observing a class at TBS. So it seems like so much has kind of linked back to my time there. All right. So, all right, enough jabbering about me. I hope that was useful. We good? We don't need a bio break? Everybody good? Great, thank you, Eric. So what I'd like to do now is start talking about the different types of decision games I use with Marines. So the first thing I'll note is that much of my approach to facilitating decision games is based on what we call Socratic Dialogue. So this, of course, draws on the questioning techniques of the famous Greek philosopher Socrates, who is known for asking deep, open-ended questions like, what is truth? What is the nature of beauty? And for our friend here at the bottom right of the screen, why is your hand on my leg? What's going up with that? But kidding aside, my job is to get participants to make and defend decisions, to think critically, and communicate their ideas clearly and concisely. And I do much of that by asking open-ended questions and creating, again, what we call this Socratic dialogue. So principally I use four types of decision games. Tactical decision games, TDGs, decision forcing cases, DFCs, decision forcing staff rides, which yes, are a close relative of DFCs, and war games, which so many of us here are aware of. So we're going to get into tactical decision games first. So many of you are familiar with TDGs. These typically consist of a fictional text-based scenario that puts you in the role of a small unit leader who has to deal with a tough tactical problem. Participants must quickly develop a situation, sketch it out, and then be ready to explain and defend it to the rest of the class. So pictured here is an example of a TDG. This is actually one of my favorites, called Rest No More, written by the very talented Dr. Andy Hershey. And this is one that I use quite often with Marines in some of these workshops I do for training and education command. So what I'm actually going to do, this also gives me an opportunity to read the comments here in the chat box. I'm going to give everybody just a few minutes. I've got my timer here to read through this scenario. And I'm totally fine with awkward silent pauses. So if you can read it, please do so. So I'll give you about another minute to finish it. So hopefully that's enough time. So we're not going to go through the TDG, but I'm going to use this to illustrate some of the techniques I use. So the first thing I draw your attention to, get back here. So if you look at the scenario, I identify 6 billet holders, right? So that's the platoon commander, 3 squad leaders, the LPOP, and the light armored vehicle detachment commander. Now, there are also 3 enemy forces, right, to the southwest, northeast, and northwest. That's going to come into play here in a few moments. Excuse me. So the first thing that I insist my participants do is, once they've read the scenario and they've got the problem, I have everybody write down their own solutions without talking to anyone. It might seem kind of master of the obvious, but it really isn't. I think many of us who have taught TDGs have seen sort of this thing happen. You deliver the exercise, or you get to the problem in the scenario, and nobody's written anything down. So you call on someone, and that person comes and briefs their solution, and then you call on somebody else and say, well, what would you do? And they simply just glom on to what was said previously and go, yeah, I would do that as well. Writing things down gets around that. It forces people to make a decision. Not everybody, in most cases, is going to have a chance to brief, but everyone should at least have the opportunity to work through the problem and then write it down and then still be ready to have to defend it. And we want that to happen without participants being biased or influenced by others. And I also ask students to write down their solutions as if they're going to give them to their subordinates over the radio, right? Not like, I would do this or I would do that. It's, no, first squad is moving to the tree line. Second squad is staying here with me. So that's again to get people in the habit of making decisions and also communicating them in realistic terms. So for the Rest No More TDG, everyone starts off as the rifle platoon commander. And then I have everyone come up with their orders for the rifle squad leaders, the 3 rifle squad leaders, the LPOP, and the LAV detachment. And then I employ what I call the brief your subordinates approach. So in the workshops that I run for the Marine Corps, help run, I usually have roughly 18 participants. So when facilitating a TDG like Rest No More, I get the students into 3 groups of 6. Then in each group, I assign the roles of platoon commander, the 3 squad leaders, the LPOP commander, and the LAV detachment commander. The platoon commander then must brief each of their subordinates, ideally verbatim, from the orders that they have just written. So again, this is to encourage realism, it's to encourage practices that you should be doing in the real world. And then we do brief backs, right? So to make sure that those orders were clearly understood, and they usually aren't, you have the participants brief back what they've been told. So each billet holder will tell their mission, their particular order, back to the platoon commander. And the platoon commanders then get an opportunity to clarify what they meant, answer any questions, and give amplifying instructions, just like in the real world. Among other things, this is a great chance to test active listening. So it turns out a lot of people are not listening as much as you'd like when the platoon commander, the billet holder, is providing their course of action. Many of you probably already know this, but you could use this technique in tabletop war games involving teams and other kinds of decision-making exercises. Another thing I really like to do is called the pre-mortem. We've all heard of post-mortem, right, from various detective shows. But the pre-mortem, which I believe was created by Dr. Gary Klein, who's an expert in the field of decision-making, It says the pre-mortem works like this. So the platoon commander gives their plan or issues their orders. The subordinates brief their missions back. And then we imagine a hypothetical future, which goes something like this. Okay, we've gone 1 hour into the future. And your plan was a total disaster. It totally failed. I'm not going to say how or why, but then you ask each student who is not part of the group, who's up at the front of the class briefing their plan, why did the plan fail? Give me one reason. And once you get that reason, you move on to another student and another until you've gone through all the students. And the reasons can be as general or specific as the students would like. For example, the facilitators, a student says, the facilitator told us that the sky is overcast, so one reason it failed. It started to rain very heavily, so heavily in fact that the LAVs got stuck in the mud. Once we've gone around the room and we've gotten all these different potential failure points, stress points to that plan, the platoon commander, again, that's part of the group briefing the class at the head of the class, can adjust their plan to cover any potential weaknesses that may have suffered or surfaced. Or he or she can leave their plan as is. It's totally their choice. Either way, this, again, gives students a chance to test the strength of their plans while keeping their pride intact. It's a very typical thing for someone to go up, a student to be picked, go up in front of the class and just get verbally knife-handed by everybody else, critiquing that plan, which actually is a good segue into another technique I like to use, which is called the Mcnamara Method. So the Mcnamara Method was developed by Major Mcnamara, a retired Marine. This might be one of my favorite techniques. And Mcnamara was an instructor at the basic school as well as the infantry officer course. And when he saw TDGs taught, this is often what happened. I'll give you a moment to read this. So the point was, don't get called. If you're a student, do not get called. You're just going to get verbally knife-handed. And the learning shuts, the bar of difficulty is so high and the stress is so high. There's just really no point in participating. So Mcnamara says, we got to come up with something different. And part of his approach is based on the argument that tactical decision games go further than just developing someone's tactical acumen or their decision making. It's also a means of creating what we call implicit communication, which is a necessary ingredient for the Marine Corps' warfighting philosophy of maneuver warfare. The idea being that if you do enough decision games, whether it's TDGs or war games, you start to really know the people you're doing this with. Imagine a group of people who've never met each other, and then they go through weeks of war games and TDGs. They're really going to start to understand who's aggressive in the group, who tends to hold back, who's shy, who's a synthesizer of ideas, who's creative, who's not. So these are things that Mcnamara wanted to get at in facilitating TDGs. He often called it kind of mind melding, so that in the event when we go to war and I'm on a hill separated from the rest of my unit because communications are down, I've worked with these folks so much doing not just decision games, but other types of training and just spending time with them, that I can reasonably expect what they're going to do given a particular situation. So here's how it works. First thing is you pick a leader. So we'll keep going back to rest no more. So you pick that platoon commander, you pick those group of 6 students, you have them come up to the front of the room. And then the students brief their understanding of the situation. This is not their plan. This is separate from the plan. The plan will come in a bit. But the first thing is, what's your commander's intent? 2 levels up, right? So if you're a squad leader, 2 levels up would be company. So what is the company trying to achieve? And what this helps do is place the student's decision in a larger context, right? That units are not just making decisions on their lonesome in a void, but they're working within a larger framework. And then we ask, what's your assumptions of the enemy mission? What is he trying to do? Because war, of course, is a competition between two or more opposing forces. So what is the enemy, the person on the other side of that table, the other side of the map, trying to accomplish? And then what's the enemy's center of gravity? What is that source of power that if we can take away from him, he will crumble? Can we discern that? And if we can, what are his vulnerabilities? How do we get to that center of gravity? And then what are your strengths? Right? What are the things that you bring to bear? So in the Rest No More TDG, you've got LAVs, you've got some anti-tank weapons in the form of AT-4s. The enemy is mechanized largely. So what can we do? And then in general terms, how do you plan to use your strengths against the enemy and put him in a dilemma, right? Where whether he goes right or left, he's damned, he's doomed. So that's the first part of it. And then it starts to get pretty fun and interesting. So we've got the student briefing his order. This is actually what he's going to do. All right, so first squad's on me, second squad you're in reserve, third squad, so on and so forth. And then you allow for no more than about 5 minutes for questions. And this is where the students, right, this is where everyone else who's receiving the order can say, well, what are your thoughts on X, Y, and Z? Or what's your timing for this particular part of the order? You know, can you speak to that? By limiting, so you're still allowing time for questions, but you're limiting questions so that it doesn't just evolve to a what if fest, right? And again, we get into that place where the billet holders are just, they're just slugging it out with the questions, and the experience really starts to drag. So then my favorite part is you say, all right, we're going to execute this plan, but we're going to use a coin. So the facilitator takes out a coin. If the coin flip is good, so let's say it's heads, the plan starts off well. And this is where, as the facilitator, you get to have some fun, you get to show some creativity, and you say, all right, so you've decided such and such with your plan, and your plan is starting to go well. This unit makes it to its position. That unit completes this action, and things are going well. But you have to update the situation enough to require follow-on decisions. Now, my personal favorite is the bad flip, the tails. When something goes wrong, and as a general rule, wink, wink, you want to aim to have more bad flips than good. And this is where things start to go off the rails. And you can inject friction, you can inject twists, but you got to keep it realistic. You've got to keep it in such a way that, again, the students don't just turn off and say, this is BS, this would never happen. You could even mix, good and bad, where, hey, the unit gets to its position and it's laying down suppressive fire on the target that the billet holder said you wanted suppressed, but it also turns out that there are far more enemy there than you realized, right? And you're in jeopardy of being overwhelmed. So in either case, you've got to tell the students how this, or the student tells us, hey, how does this affect your plan? And do you want to change your plan at all? And then you allow for another brief discussion. You've got questions going on. Again, keep it to a brief exchange, 4 or 5 minutes. And then you flip another coin and you update the situation. So one of the big benefits of this approach is most CDGs end with that problem and the initial solution that the billet holder provides. This gives you more bang for your buck. You could take one TDG and theoretically play it out to its logical conclusion. Next, you can kill, quote unquote, or incapacitate the billet holder and then pick someone else to fill that person's shoes. And then you have that new billet holder. So let's say, hey, platoon commander, you're dead. First squad leader, you're taking over as the platoon commander. And you can go back to our previous slide where they then give us, that new platoon commander is now giving us their understanding of the battlefield, their understanding of their strengths, their weaknesses, the enemy's center of gravity. Again, it's allowing the entire class to kind of peek inside that person's head and go, this is how they see the battlefield, right? Which done enough times should move everybody towards implicit communication. And then you ask him or her what they want to do. Do you want to stick with the original plan, or do you want to do something different? And of course, you ask some good follow-up questions like why not? And then you flip another coin and you update the situation. And I've done this many times at this point, and the students are sitting on the edge of their seat waiting to see the results of that coin flip. Now, something I also like to do is I will have, so let's say again in these workshops, I've got 3 groups of 6. I've called one group of 6 up to the classroom. Platoon commander briefs his plan. We go through the Mcnamara Method. We do the coin flips. And then I say, all right, everyone, all 3 groups are going to adopt this platoon commander's plan. So scrap whatever plan you came up with. But the platoon commander, what he's just briefed, we're all going with that plan. And then I'll kill or incapacitate all of the platoon commanders in the room and set them aside. And then what I do for fun is I say, you're now, so I have everybody else resume planning. All right, we just got a bad coin flip. We've got new platoon commanders in place. First squad leader in each group has moved to become the platoon commander. So there's a lot of chaos. But I take the killed platoon commanders and I say, all right, you're now the enemy. Say, you're in charge of and I'll give them more details. So it's actually, a platoon reinforced that's in the Southwest. It's a company minus in the Northeast. And I'll give them a little detail, and I'll give them additional details. Say, okay, based on the situation, what are you doing next as the enemy? And that's something that they can brief later on. So this is one way, I think, to keep those players who've been killed engaged. And now you're also flipping the table, or I'm sorry, flipping the map and looking at it from the enemy's perspective. Oops. And I think a few more notes on that. I also like to include injects or realistic updates to the situation. So for instance, I might say, and I'll be doing this as the various groups are updating their plan as a result of the coin flip. Say platoon commanders, another 2, and I'm shouting this out, right? I'm walking around the room. It's getting a little chaotic. I'm quickening the pace of my speech. Platoon commanders, 2 more LAVs have arrived from the southeast near the ford. They're engaging the enemy infantry in the field due west. The LAV section commander is asking, where do you want these new forces? Or I might say, a section of Cobra helicopters have just arrived on scene and checked in with you. They have full loadouts of guns and rockets. What do you want them to do, platoon commanders? And you can tell people are, because of the killing of the platoon commanders, the moving around, the shifting around of billets, and these injects, the coin flips, the exercise is far more dynamic than simply everybody read the situation, come up with your solution, brief it, and we'll move on. So things get pretty chaotic, and it's pretty damn fun. So those are some thoughts on techniques that I like to use in TDGs. So let's now turn to decision forcing cases. These are the things that I really grew up on that are probably dearest to my heart. But DFCs are much like tactical decision games in that they place participants in the role of decision makers, but where DFCs differ in large part is that they're based strictly on facts. They actually happened. So they involve real people. In the previous scenario, you're some generic platoon commander in a country that isn't even named, and you're fighting a foe who isn't named, and we don't know all the details about the conflict. In a decision-forcing case, that's not the case. You're drawing from history. And another important difference is that tactical decision games tend to focus on tactical situations. Decision-forcing cases can focus on all types of situations, all types of subjects. And unlike TDGs, DFCs have an ending. They have an outcome, an historical outcome, which you can provide at the end of the exercise, not as the right answer. We always try to avoid that. I don't like saying the historical solution, because even the word solution, I think for many students is synonymous with right. This is what we should be doing. I say the historical outcome. Sometimes in a case, things go incredibly badly. But we give them the historical outcome because now students can compare and contrast their own solutions to what actually happened. There's some data point. There's something they can point to and say, this is how it really turned out. Here's what I was thinking. That's interesting. I didn't consider this aspect. Or the decision maker in the scenario, in the real world, didn't consider these things that really jumped out to me. So here's a case. Here's an example of a case that we often use in the workshops. This one's called Funeral Details. I'm just going to show you a few slides. So in this case, we start off, we give some background. I say it's 1 August 1966. And I put students into pairs. So I say, one of you is the Commandant of the Marine Corps, gentleman on the left, General Wallace M. Green. And the other is Sergeant Major Herbert J. Sweet, the 4th Sergeant Major of the Marine Corps. And I'll say, please self-select, someone pick to be the Commandant, someone pick to be the Sergeant Major. So he gives some background, what's going on in 1966, what's happening in the world, what's going on with America's commitments abroad. Of course, we've got Vietnam. And then I tell the students, you and the Sergeant Major have just heard some terrible news coming out of Texas. And what's that news? The news is this man here, Charles J. Whitman, has just killed or wounded 41 people at the University of Texas at Austin. He was then killed by police officers. Now, if you stop there, you go, this is terrible. This is an awful thing. But what does it have to do with the Marine Corps? Well, quite a lot. It turns out that Charles Whitman, the alleged shooter, was an honorably discharged Marine. This means that, technically speaking, he rates honors at his funeral: a flag on his coffin, an honor guard, and pallbearers. So then I turn to the sergeants major in the room, and I say, so, Sergeant Major, what do you think about this? And how are you going to advise the Commandant? What are you telling him? Oh, and by the way, we've got Vietnam going on. And 36% as of May, so it's August in the scenario, but as of May, 36% of the American population is against the war. And more than that, your Division of Information officer, which we now call the Public Affairs Office, has just said this. I'll give you a moment to read. So this is the PAO of the Marine Corps advising the Commandant and Sergeant Major on what to do next. So this is a tough problem to solve. And these are the sorts of things that I think make up a good DFC. Now, I want to know that DFCs, again, are good for any subject. They don't need to be ethics. They don't have to be higher level leadership. You can do DFCs on everything from small unit tactics, much like a TDG, to administrative problems, to logistics, to grand strategic challenges. Now, something I'd really like to try, so they call the nesting doll technique. I haven't tried this yet, and if anyone on here has, I'd love to hear their experience. But the idea is that you take a single event, and then let's say you take an infantry battalion or a company, and then you give tailored cases, tailored DFCs of that event from the perspective of different people in the unit. So, for instance, you take a case where a Marine truck company, motorized transportation company, has to support an infantry battalion's clearing operation in Afghanistan. So you give that to, let's say, some captains or the senior leadership in the unit. And then at the same time, you take your staff and the staff sergeants to do a similar DFC, say in a nearby room where they must determine how best to support how best to support the maintenance of that truck company that's getting ready to assist the infantry battalion in that clearing operation. And then finally, say in another room, you take your most junior Marines, Lance corporals, PFCs, maybe the corporals, and you give them their own problem, again, within that larger context. Hey, you've got 5 deadline trucks. You know, the skipper says that we need to get these things up and running post haste to help, you know, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines with this clearing operation we're doing tomorrow. How best do you want to go about fixing these things? Oh, and by the way, there are all these other complications that we have to deal with. We're undermanned, we don't have enough tools, some vehicles are in worse distress than others, and so on and so forth. And then ideally what I would do is at the end of the exercise, I get everyone together to do an after action review and then see how up and down that unit people responded to the problems at their respective levels. So before we move on to the next type of decision game, I just want to ask, do we need a bio break? I know I've been talking here for a little bit. Happy to take 5 minutes. Yes, so let's take 5 minutes. I'll ask everyone in those 5 minutes, come up with a few questions, right? They can be on what we've discussed so far, what's unclear, what's muddy, what you find interesting, but please take the next 5 minutes. I've got a timer. I will avail myself of this opportunity and happy to answer those questions when we come back. All right, I'll see you in 5.
As we wait for everyone to come back from their break, we'll ask Damien some questions. First question I'll read from Bryant is, as someone who didn't have experience in the Marine Corps working with other Marines, how did you approach gaming solutions that would blend well with the conditioning and molding of officers? Did it require immersion on your part, or did your history background give you a solid base?
Sorry, got it. Okay. So I think the question was, I've got it. Immersion, use of history. I'd say both. I mean, we'll use the basic school as an example. That's a place where you've got these young lieutenants who, from most, are not coming in with any sort of military experience. Now, there are what we call Mustangs, prior enlisted Marines who've been commissioned, and they may have experience. But this is a place where, ideally, creativity is championed and encouraged. Not always the case. There are techniques and procedures and other things that the Marine Corps wants these folks to learn. But I would simply encourage whatever decisions were coming out. I'd encourage creative decision making. I certainly used history to help in facilitating. But I think having so much experience at that point with talking to folks like Eric or working with people like Bruce and seeing Bruce, for instance, work with these international colonels, work with the staff NCOs, maybe by osmosis, maybe by simply observing, I got a sense of what would make sense in responding to a student solution. You know, what's an appropriate way to paraphrase? What's an appropriate way to get a conversation back on track if it's gone way, way down a rabbit hole? I'm not sure if that answers the question. I can also reread it here and give it another shot.
Damien, we'll move on to another question. It says, okay, when you're writing cases, how do you choose them? Is there a method or something you look for, or do you feel like you can make them pretty much into any good case?
I love this question. So I look for wicked problems. I look for complex problems. I look for things that you look at. You know, you're reading through a history book. You're reading Infantry Attacks by Rommel. And he's talking about some of his operations in Italy or Romania. And when you, as the reader, get that pit in your stomach feeling like, oh crap, how's Rommel going to get out of this one? I mean, he's got enemies to his right, he's got enemies to his left, he's surrounded. That's your case. You want to engender in the participants, the people experiencing that, the same sort of stress, the same sort of, oh, how are we going to do this? I've talked a lot with Sean McCann, my colleague, about this. We've in the course of doing a lot of these workshops, a lot of people don't, particularly Marines who've been in for a little bit, have tons of experiences that would make for a good DFC, but they don't necessarily know it. They're so close to the experience, it being their own experience, that they can't see, oh, I made a decision. And this was a pretty complex situation. This wasn't a routine problem. There were multiple ways to solve this. There was no clear example. So I think looking at your own experiences and just saying, what are some really tough situations that I had to handle, and I didn't know how things were going to turn out, and I didn't know all the information, and yet I still needed to act in the face of that uncertainty. But as for sources, again, memoirs, looking at Rommel's attacks, looking at just any situation that just doesn't have a clear answer and you could approach from multiple angles, I think is a good first step.
I guess another question here by Ed is, are there any good examples of people teaching cases on YouTube or other some models, social media resources, or other ways to learn more?
Yeah, so thanks for the question, Ed. I don't think there are many videos, actually. I know for the College of Distance Education and Training, I did a video kind of modeling a DFC. I don't think we put that up on YouTube. So I don't think there are too many things out there. Certainly something I'd like to see more of. I do know that Bruce Goodmanson, who I've mentioned before, does, so he has something called the Decision Game Club, which meets, I want to say, I think it's every week. Now, because of COVID, they've moved everything online, but he's got 2 tracks, the group that meets in person at the Gray Research Center in Quantico, and then the group that does online decision games. It's not the same thing as seeing somebody teach it in person, but you do get an opportunity to see a master case facilitator and developer facilitate a case online. But yeah, I'd love to see videos of Marines, especially teaching DFCs to other Marines.
We'll stop there for the questions for now. Keith, for anyone who has questions, you can text them to the chat, to everyone, or to myself. I'll try to keep track of them as they flow in. Damien, it's over to you again.
Awesome. And thank you, by the way, for all these great questions. I love having to think on my feet. These are very thoughtful. And if I don't answer them in the course of our chat here tonight, you're more than welcome to reach out to me and continue the talk elsewhere. So, all right, let me move the chat here. Okay, so the next technique that I really like to use, I don't get to do it in the workshops, but I've had plenty of experience doing it back at the basic school and for other organizations, but it's the decision forcing staff ride. So basically, these are DFCs that take place on the actual grounds of the events in the case. Now, they differ from traditional staff rides in that the aim is not to try to teach the whole battle or tell students how everything turned out ahead of time. It's instead we're picking, let's say, 4 to 5 spots on the battlefield where tough decisions were made by commanders, including small unit commanders. So in the case of Civil War staff rides, battalions, batteries. And again, the point is not so much about the battle per se, but we're giving them opportunities to make decisions on actual battlegrounds. This is where, no kidding, the Battle of Manassas took place, or Brandy Station is another favorite. And this gives them a chance to understand how terrain, how distance, how time affects their plans, and hopefully interest them in learning more about the battle on their own. I've been to enough traditional staff rides where Students are assigned a station, they're assigned some part of the battle. Everybody goes to that part of that battlefield and they talk about what General Lee was thinking on day 2 or day 3, whatever it is, of Gettysburg, and the difficult circumstances that plagued him. That's certainly beneficial, but I think for many people, they go home and essentially it's battlefield tourism. They kind of forget much of what they got out of it. What you could do instead is, you're General Lee, it's day 2 of the Battle of Gettysburg. Here's, no kidding, the map showing the unit dispositions, both of your forces and what we know of the enemy forces. What do you want to do? Or even better, think about Pickett's charge. You could go to the area of Pickett's charge. We know how Pickett's charge ends. So maybe doing that as a decision point itself from the perspective of Pickett wouldn't be as rich an experience, but you could say you're the Confederate officer in charge of the artillery that is preparing the way for the breakthrough that Pickett's charge should result in. How do you want to plan, or how do you want to support that attack? What does that look like? Where do you want to place your guns? What other kind of amplifying orders or directions are you going to give to your guys? And then brief that to the rest of the group, who now aren't seeing things on a map. They're looking at the terrain, and they can say, so you're saying you want to do such and such with your artillery, but we know that there's Union artillery on that hill over there. How's that going to work here, General? Or how's that going to work here, Colonel? So that's one thing that I like to do, and I've had, I think, some success with. Another thing that I've found pretty useful is the 2-sided decision forcing staff ride. So you divide your participants into 2 groups. Let's say, again, using the Civil War example, you've got one group playing Union forces and another playing Confederate forces. And then each side will go about the battlefield, stopping at various stations. And what you see here on the screen are station guides, which orient the participants both geographically, but also situationally. You can see there's orientation, narration, putting people in the role of the different commanders. And then after the staff ride, everybody would regroup, and then over a meal or back in the classroom, discuss the problems that each side encountered and how they tried to solve them. What's really fun is you create a staff ride where the sides are playing opposing commanders, right? So like here in this example, which I believe is from Antietam, you've got Lieutenant James Stewart of the 4th U.S. Artillery. He's got Battery B, and then he's coming up against General McLaw's 1st Division in the beginning of Antietam. So have those 2 groups kind of mirror each other throughout the staff ride. And then again, at the end of the experience, say, hey, when we were at Station 1, you guys were General McLaw, we were Lieutenant Stewart, and we came up with this course of action. What did you guys come up with? And I think you can really get kind of a rich understanding of the decision-making on both sides, and hopefully have a better understanding of why the historical commanders did what they did. So last but not least, our traditional tabletop war games. So in the workshop I do with Marines, I've got about 3 hours, which is not enough time, never enough time, to really introduce, at least not enough time for me, I'd like more. But I've got about 3 hours to introduce wargaming to about 18 people. Many of whom have never played a war game, at least they think they haven't played, they can't remember. And they might be hesitant to see a tabletop game as anything other than a game and not a training tool for war. So because of the lack of time, I do what's called a blended Kriegspiel. So I give the participants the historical background of the game. So as you can see, we use a game called Brandywine 1777, which is part of the Pub Battles series, which is put out by Command Post Games. Highly recommended. Yes, by the way, Pub Battles, that name is intentional. It was designed to be played in a pub. Both the map and the wood blocks representing the units are sturdy and made to withstand getting soaked. So war games, adult beverages go well together. They encourage social learning. So we do this blended Kriegspiel. So what I do is I provide the participants with some rules, some left and rights, as they say, kind of general rules on how combat and movement work. But there are lots of places in the game, and pub battles, the pub battle series is actually designed with this in mind, where the two sides have to stop and figure out, how does this actually work? How would this work in real life? Which I think is great. How would the particulars of this unit movement work, or this combat action would work? It fosters discussion between the groups. And what I also do is I encourage everyone to use what they've learned. I give them some background on how combat in 1777 works. Hey, units typically travel in columns, and they travel quickly in columns, but they have to attack in lines. And it takes time to move from column to line and vice versa. And then I also encourage the students to use their common sense and their tactical knowledge as Marines to help work through any problems they encounter. Now, we typically do 2 rounds of Brandywine. The first game is usually very frustrating for the participants. It's happened so many times at this point that I usually don't worry. But I'll tell you, the first few times it was uncomfortable. But it's interesting because without realizing it, the Marines are testing themselves on a number of levels. They're testing how well they work as a team. They're testing how inclusive they are of fellow players. It's easy to have 2 or 3 players dominate on each side, and then 1 or 2 just kind of hang out to the side. Maybe they think war games aren't for me, or games aren't for me. How well does each side get everybody included? And it also, things can get heated, right? You've got Marines, keep in mind, right? Your typical Marine, A-type personality, they want to win. So when there's disagreements, things can get pretty heated. You're seeing how well people communicate with each other and how well they understand just basic tactics. So again, it's easy for students to tune out or give up during the first game. And that's where I, as the facilitator, try to jump in. We'll have 2 games typically going simultaneously. So I'm jumping back and forth, or I'm having another facilitator jump back and forth and answer questions. Remind players of the initial rules or key historical considerations, again, line versus column, and resolving problems that the teams don't resolve on their own. And admittedly, I walk a tightrope here because I'm trying to induce what UCLA learning and memory expert Dr. Robert Bork calls desirable difficulties. So the idea is that by making the experience sufficiently but not overwhelmingly difficult through not providing all the rules, having the players have to resolve problems on their own, talking with each other, and really just throwing them into the game. Because I think they get about 20 to 25 minutes of historical background, basic rules, and then I say, all right, let's go over to the maps. That's a bit hair-raising for people, right? I'm looking to increase learning by injecting these desirable difficulties. Most of the time it works. It can go off the rails, and so you do have to be careful. A lot of things, I think, play into the situation. But I've found that it tends to work. Something else that we've come up with, and this is something that my colleague Sean McCann thought of, was let's select observer/liaison officers. And this is someone that will typically assign in each group, right? So you got 2 games. You've got the British on one side, and then you've got the colonials on the other. So each of those groups will have an observer liaison. And the observer liaisons, as you can see, serve for critical functions. They write down what happens each turn. They're making observations, which we'll share at the after-action review. They'll track which units have taken hits, as well as the overall kind of progression of points in the game. This is very critical in these workshops where we're trying to push critical thinking. So we ask the observer liaisons to apply critical thinking, and we'll ask them to use what we call the standards and elements of the Paul and Elder model of critical thinking to their side's moves. Why do we make the move? Why are we making the moves we're making? Is there enough depth and breadth in our thought process for these decisions we're making? And then most key is that last point you see. You have them act as a rule negotiator and liaison to the other team, to their counterpart on the other team. Because again, you're dealing with Marines who want to win, right? Even if they're frustrated the first 20, 30 minutes of the game, they want to win. And they will sea lawyer each other saying, no, you can't make that move because you're at the end of your command and control range, or no, if you do column, then line, then column, all of these movements are going to eat up your movement, and no, that the rule isn't allowed. And the game can just devolve into arguing. So we came up with this idea of when that happens, and let's say I'm unavailable, I'm with the other team, I'm with the other game, that's when the observer liaisons say, everyone else shut up, you and I are talking, what makes sense here? The observer liaisons are members of their respective teams, so they can play, but they're also, and I'll tell them beforehand, I need you to be as impartial and unbiased as you can when these complications come up. And hopefully those two will come to an agreement, and then they'll establish a convention which the game which the players will observe for the rest of the game. So we've had a lot of success with that. It doesn't always work, right? Again, sometimes liaison officers are still very partial. That's ultimately where I'll step in and say, hey, it wouldn't make sense for this to happen, or we'll even flip a coin. I'll go back to the coin that I've been using for the TDGs, and I'll say, all right, heads, your approach is now the convention, tails, it's yours. And we'll do that to keep the game play going. Now, you might be asking, 3 hours, 2 games of brandy wine, what are you trying to accomplish here? What's the so what? What's the point? And as Colonel Eric Walters likes to say, I'm trying to create a conversion experience. So this is a picture from one of our more recent workshops of Marines playing brandy wine, and you can see the expressions on their face. They're having a good time. Again, we're hitting them in that effective domain, and we trust that learning is happening. I want the Marines to experience the benefit of war games, and tabletop games in particular. I want them to see that they don't need hugely expensive contractor-provided simulations to get value from a war game. They can use a map, and they can use some blocks, create some basic rules, and be off to the races. I think in every workshop, not everybody, of course, buys off on using tabletop war games, but certainly a lot do. And many of them will say, hey, where'd you get this game? I want to play this with my son. And when I hear things like that, I'm going, okay, not only is this good for that participant's development, but it's also good for the larger wargaming community, because they're trying to get their family involved now, which I always think is great. All right, this is from earlier. We just took a bio break. I'm happy to take other questions, or we have just a few slides left, so I can also just get to the end, and then we can save the rest of the time for questions. So unless anyone objects, I'm happy to keep going and then take the rest of the questions at the end. So I will do that. So what am I up to lately? So I've mentioned multiple times these workshops. These have been going on for we're in our 3rd year. They started in late December. They started in late 2017. They're part of the Innovative Instruction Workshop. They're a 2-week workshop. I get about 3 days, 3.5 days to introduce these different types of decision games, minus the staff rides. We don't do those there, though I'd love to. But we introduced the decision games to the participants. We've done about 17 of those so far across Training and Education Command. Those, unfortunately, have been put on hold because of COVID-19. So we're looking at ways to keep the momentum up. But in the meantime, I've really gotten interested and really put a lot of my focus on this idea of using decision games as recruiting tools. So this is something that I've always found interesting, that we generally reserve introducing TDGs and DFCs and war games for the basic school or for later on in enlisted Marines career. And I thought that's odd. I think if we want decision makers and critical thinkers and all of these other things, let's start at the very, very beginning. And you can't get much more than very beginning than with the recruiting process. So using this to attract people to the Marine Corps, to inform them about the Marine Corps, to start developing people's decision-making skills. So all of that to say this, I wrote an article for the Marine Corps Gazette called Can You Beat a Marine? Which again makes the case for decision games is as recruiting tools. That, to my delight, got a rebuttal from a First Lieutenant, Davis Parker, very smart guy, who disagrees. I'm in the process of writing a reply to that. But it's been very interesting to see the conversations happening, and the news articles coming out in the midst of COVID-19. The Army has shuttered all of its recruiting stations. It's also moved all of its recruiting online. And the Army started an esports team as a recruiting tool back in 2018, I want to say, and they're going gangbusters. They are streaming games every day on multiple platforms: Facebook, Twitch, YouTube, and I'll check their Facebook page about every day. And every time they stream, within hours, they're getting upwards of a few thousand hits, shares, comments. The Navy has just put together their own esports team. I think it's called Goats and Glory, or Glory and Goats, one of those two. So they're not too far behind. The Air Force, they've got their hands in that pot as well. The Air Force Academy has an esports team. There's a gaming app in development with the Air Force where they're looking to use that to entice people to learn about the Air Force. The Marine Corps has next to nothing. So after writing this article, Can You Beat a Marine? I had several young captains reach out to me and say, hey, there are some of us out here pushing games as a means of recruiting. I mean, there's all sorts of stats and statistics that you can draw on. The number of people who are playing games in the United States is just mind-boggling. It's insane. And I think that trend is only going to continue. So one person in particular that I have in mind who was interviewed for this article here, the Marine Corps Times article here on the right, Captain Michael Majetti. So he's out there doing God's work, at least in my mind. In December 2019, so he's out in Texas, but in December 19, he led the Marine Corps' first event at an esports tournament with pretty good results. And he's also pushing to do more things like that. And I've, again, through my network, been hearing from this or that captain or this or that recruiting station commanding officer, hey, we can't do our pool functions the way we usually do it, so we're going to do a Call of Duty tournament, or we're going to do a Smash tournament. And I've said, hey, that's great. If you want to really differentiate yourself from the other services, focus on decision-making. Tie it into your core values. Tie it to critical thinking, teamwork, these other things. And beyond that, if you can, especially when COVID-19 clears up, do more than just digital games. Do tabletop games. Do DFCs. Do TDGs. You can deliver a DFC without any media, right? You could deliver a DFC by word of mouth, by simply saying, hey, I want you to picture, here's the setting, here's the scene. You are such and such. You're Sergeant Nick Galvan. You're a squad leader in 3rd Platoon, India Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. It's March 2003, and you were on the way to Baghdad. So on and so forth. Problem, what do you do? I don't think any of the other services are doing that. They're very focused on e-gaming. I will say the Army, again, I think they're leading the pack here. The Army has started a tabletop team for Warhammer 40K. And they've already participated. They've already gone to tournaments. They plan to do more. And I think there is absolutely a way to merge and fuse the branding aspect of the Marine Corps with games, and to do it in such a way that respects and also separates itself from what the other services are doing. And I think that's what I have for that. And frankly, I think if the Marine Corps doesn't catch up, especially now where all recruiting is digital, right? In the age of COVID-19, how do you recruit people? You can't go up to them. You can't bring them down to the office and say, how many push-ups are you going to do? But you can say, let's jump on the server and play around at Close Combat 3. or whatever it is. So that's something that I'm really kind of encouraging the Marine Corps to do, and we'll see what happens. And then to kind of round things out, here are just some thoughts on getting into the decision game world. And the first is read. Read as much as you can on decision games, the different types of decision games, on military history, on adult learning, on critical thinking, and anything else related to this topic. The more you read, the more you know. The more you know, the more valuable you are to an organization. Second is write as often as you can. If you want to see what you really know about something, there are two things you can do. You can write about it, or you can teach it. Getting published will also, I think, separate you from your peers and get the attention from organizations looking to hire. Third, and I cannot stress this enough, but find decision game mentors, teachers, coaches. Find your Eric Walters, find your Bruce Goodmansons, find your Peter Perlas, your Jim Dunnigans, your Sebastian Bays of the world, seriously, and email them and find them and connect. Offer to help them with a project or a paper, even if it's just editing something. I wouldn't, again, if you're starting out, don't shy away from pro bono work. I can only speak for myself, but if I did not meet people like Eric and Bruce to help me out early on, I don't think we'd be having this conversation tonight. So I seriously encourage people, if there's a game you're really interested in, whether it's digital or tabletop, and you just really want to understand the mechanics, find that game designer's name, look them up on LinkedIn, and connect and pick their brain. You will be surprised, I think, at how receptive people are and how people who have been in the business longer than you are willing and excited to help those just getting into the game. And then finally, play and design as many kinds of decision games as you can. The more kinds of exercises you can build and facilitate, I think the more valuable you can be to an organization. And if for whatever reason you plan to run a war game and the pieces didn't show up with your luggage, or your luggage gets lost, but you still got to deliver something, hey, switch to a TDG or a series of TDGs. Use those coin flips. See if you got some DFCs in your back pocket. You can, I think, achieve, at least when it comes to the educational side of things, decision-making, communication, critical thinking, you can achieve the same goals in a war game that you ought to be able to achieve in some of these others. It's not a one-for-one swap. You lose that, hey, I'm playing against somebody. What I often say is in a TDG, you're fighting the imagination of the author. In a DFC, you're fighting what actually happened. You're fighting against, the circumstances of history. And then in a wargaming, you're fighting a living, breathing person who is trying to beat you. But I just offer that as a way of kind of breaking into this wonderful world of decision games. So with that said, questions, comments, curses? I think we've got about 28 minutes left. Here's my contact information. I see a ton of things on the chat box, which I have not attended to. I'm sorry about that.
Damien, this is Sebastian. So I have a question for you. It says, do you use quantitative methods like decision quality, key performance metrics, agent-based modeling, or structure analytic techniques to analyze or optimize your games, cases, or research? If so, can you talk about them?
So sadly, no, but I'd love to. Sean McCann and I have talked a lot about let's do the research and let's get the data, because I think most of us who do war games, decision games, have a pretty good hunch that learning is occurring, right? We do the TDGs and we see the ahas, or we do the DFCs and we go, something is present now that wasn't present before, which is great. That's a start. But how do we know they're actually thinking critically? How do we know that they're improving their thinking over time? So one of the things that we've discussed is, let's come up with a rubric, again, based on the Paul and Elder model of critical thinking. There are other models, but this is one that we like and is well known in the Marine Corps, even though I wouldn't say it's widely adhered to or used. But let's come up with rubrics and other tools that we can use in research to determine, has there been, from day one with this group to day 30, has there been an improvement of critical thinking that we can point to and say, yes, this is happening? So yeah, to the question, Sebastian, no, we haven't used much of that stuff, but I'd love to. I think there's so much fun, interesting work to be done in the world of decision games and using them as tools to measure growth of various kinds.
Another question for you, Damien, is I've heard wargaming has a pretty hard time recruiting good adjudicators and facilitators. Is there an effort to create training programs for designers? What would be the major considerations?
Yeah, great question. As of now, I don't think there's much of a movement. I can only really speak for the Marine Corps. I'll say that in these workshops we do, a fair number of participants come in with some background, some interest, some experience with decision games, and I would love for them to leave, being full converts in the benefit, the value, the use, of decision games, and then continue to develop themselves. But as far as I can tell, there's no Brandon McBreen, who's another huge. I'm a huge fan of Brandon McBreen, and he did a world of good for the Marine Corps in terms of decision games and decision-making exercises. He mentioned, and he had written several articles, I think, on the subject. The Marine Corps had no, and doesn't have any course focused on decision-making, focused strictly on decision-making, or focused on decision games. That's something that I pitched to Training and Education Command in 2016, I want to say, of let's have a course or a series of courses, almost a menu that facilitators or soon-to-be facilitators or even people in the Fleet Marine Force could draw from and say, I want to do 2 weeks, a 2-week course on DFCs, or a 2-week course on TDGs, or a 2-week course on digital games. Yes, this would cost money and manpower and all these other things, but as far as I know, there certainly isn't anything for company grade leaders or young NCOs and staff NCOs. They get it in some places. I know the College of Enlisted Professional Military Education has a block on, I think they have blocks on TDGs and DFCs, but the last time I checked it's a handful of hours. And I'm not saying that isn't useful and not beneficial, because I've known some great facilitators that come out of that program. But I think we could go so much further. And I see right here, someone saying, yeah, Brandon, you're saying the course exists, somewhat advanced maneuver warfare course. Yeah, so I've got contact with some of the folks at McTog. I think they're doing great stuff. Again, my only beef with that is who's going to McTog. These are mostly company commanders, or I'm saying for this particular course, company commanders, majors, which are good. You want those people to get bought in. But I am openly and freely willing to admit that I'm biased. I spent enough time at the basic school to come away with the belief that if you want to make changes in an organization, you want to infuse that organization with a desire for and an acceptance of decision games, you have to start at the start. Start at the basic school. As far as I can tell, I don't think there's any package or group of classes that lieutenants get on how to teach their Marines. It's kind of like, well, the captains leading you through the curriculum are modeling one way of teaching, but that can be a crapshoot, right? So there's no block of instruction that says, hey, today we're going to give you some rudimentary ideas or tools that you can use when you're a platoon commander, or when you're a section leader, or when you're in the maintenance shop and you've got downtime because of COVID-19. So I think a lot of people are out there trying to do good things. I don't think there's much in the way of what the question was asking now. And let's see, I can look at the, yes, all models are wrong. Some models are useful. I love that. Do you have any good book recommendations for facilitators to look into or websites to use for references on other good techniques for facilitating war games? Yes, there are a few things. So I run a group called the Warfighting Society. I help run the Warfighting Society, which is modeled off of Gerhard Scharnhorst's Military Society. We've got a Dropbox link, which you can access, and there are plenty of materials there. Bruce Goodmanson has a website. Please correct me, Eric, or someone else, the exact name. I want to say it's like the Military Instructor Gateway, something like that. If you just go, you type in case method, comma, Bruce Goodmanson, I think Bruce's website will come up. That's mostly dedicated to decision forcing cases. There are lots of other resources that Bruce has and is always happy and willing to provide. And I can also provide lots of materials. Oh, and then of course, this group that we're a part of, the Georgetown University Wargaming Society, they have a G Drive, which has lots of good materials. And I know they're adding stuff all the time. So there are things out there.
Another question here by Andy says, how do you get past the nerd factor of games and get buy-in from participants? I know you talked about it a bit earlier and in your writing, but can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, Andy, I think it's a fantastic question. There are a lot of different ways. I think the first is, if you just, I love seeing this every time. We're in the workshop, right? And we're on a 10-minute break, and people are, getting up to get coffee or whatever. And then a ton of people are just sitting there on their phones playing games. And I think most of you guys already play games of some sort. So it's not that far of a jump to think of games as a training tool. The other thing is, the Marine Corps is much nerdier historically than people give credit for. So in this article that I'm writing in reply to the rebuttal to First Lieutenant Davis Parker, does anybody remember what was it? The chess commercial that Marine Corps Recruiting Command put out in, I want to say 1989, 1990.
Yeah, this is Andy. Yeah, I'm old enough to remember that. That's awesome.
Yeah. So it features a giant chessboard with people, some of the characters look like warlocks. There's magic lightning. It's a game, right? It's chess. It's one of the oldest competitive games, I think, out there. The Game of Kings. So that's one reference point that you can call on to say, hey, this is not unusual or nerdy as you think, because that got a lot of people to sign up. Another one more recently was in 97, 98 called Rite of Passage. This was during the tenure of General Krulak, as commandant. But it shows this young man in this arena, and he's braving this death-defying obstacle course, and then he reaches this bridge, and then a chasm. The chasm is filled with this like bridge of energy or light. And as the young man is walking across the bridge, a lava monster appears from below, and this young man has to slay a lava monster, and then he transforms mystically into a Marine. Sounds like the stuff of games to me. And that commercial got a lot of people to sign up. I mean, it's even referenced in Generation Kill, the lava monster commercial, that's what got me to sign up. Or you go on YouTube and you just type in Marine Corps recruiting commercials. Those two that I've mentioned, I think, are the most popular around. So there's that aspect. You can also go the route of, hey, who's used this stuff? What other militaries have used war games? And of course, you've got the Prussians and Germans, who I think are the model. And who was it? The chief of staff, I think it was the Prussian general staff at the time, von Muffling, who, after seeing a Kriegspiel demonstrated. He said, "This isn't a game. This is preparation for war. I must have it for my army." And I think the Germans knew a thing or two about how to prepare for combat. I think few people would argue about that. So there's that aspect. I think third and finally, I think this is a self-correcting problem. I think that many of us are looking at it from the view of our generation and older generations. Generation Z, the generation that will predominantly make up the Marine Corps for years to come, they're all about games. They are all about games. They don't think it's nerdy. They love games. They're playing them all the time. I think the Navy, in one article I was seeing recently, said that young people spend, and this boggles my mind, but young people spend up to 9 hours a day interacting in some form with games, whether it's playing them or just watching other people play them on Twitch. So I think it's really valuable for us to look at this not only from the perspective of those who are currently in favor of games and those who for decades have seen the value, but the generation that's coming up is seemingly all about them. Hopefully that gets to.
Yeah, that was great. If I can just take a couple of minutes, I used to teach expeditionary warfare school distance education, and I would bring in my nerdy tabletop games to my students to try and break down this ice. And I had success bringing in Star Wars X-Wing in order to teach John Boyd's, OODA loop.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And they loved it. As once they got past the nerd factor,
yes,
and they were like, there's, X-Wing, there's spaceships on the table that we usually have our military maps spread out on.
Yeah.
But within 5 minutes, they're in there, they're rolling dice, they're arguing with each other.
Sure.
So, I wanted to know those were things, what you just said was very, very helpful. If you can just jump in with both feet, I embrace my nerdiness and just hold it out there for everybody to see. And the young captains and lieutenants, said, hey, well, we like our instructor. He's cool. He's into this. Maybe this is cool. So,
yeah, totally. No,
yeah. So thanks very much for taking the time to answer that question. It was very helpful.
Yeah, happy to. And I think you hit the nail on the head. There's often, certainly in these workshops, there's often reservation. What is this? What are we going to do? And I just say, just trust me. Just trust me. It's going to be disorienting. You guys are going to be arguing. It's going to be confusing. You'll be moving these blocks around, but just trust me. And I think by that point in the workshop, there is, because that's usually day 6 of a 10-day workshop, there is a sufficient amount of trust. And then they see, holy crap, this is a pretty cool training tool. And I think, to your point, you can, if you get past that initial hesitation, I think my screen is starting to dim because I've got Flux on there. Sorry about that. I forgot to turn it off. But it won't matter what game you play. You could do Twilight Imperium. You could do Scythe. You do all these other things. If you can get them to see that the contents of the game don't matter, the process, that's what matters. It's making decisions, pitting strength against weakness, thinking critically, communicating with your team. We could be playing, Rick and Morty, the D&D version of Rick and Morty, right? Which does exist, that's a thing. And still benefit from it and have fun in the course of doing that. So thanks so much for that. I think that was great. As a facilitator, how do you deal with the fact that sometimes the participants will not have all the necessary information to make a decision, particularly with strategic problems on topics and times people don't know well? Great question. I still force them to make a decision, right? I think one of the principal functions of a leader of any type is to make decisions in the face of uncertainty. You want to give them, we talk about this in the workshop with how much, so you're doing a DFC. We actually, and one thing I've neglected to mention is, and I think it actually answers a question in part that I was asked earlier about training people to do these things. We don't just run people through several iterations of decision games. We have them build their own. So I have the participants, at least for a DFC, they'll build the skeleton, and I'll give them a framework. With a TDG, I'll get them in small groups, and we'll give them big Post-it notes, and they'll sketch out a situation. And for many of them, this is the first time they've ever done it. But with DFCs, I'll pose the question, how much detail is enough? And I think this is kind of where the art of decision game development, particularly with DFCs, comes in. And it's tricky. So the first thing we have to acknowledge is that any of these things is a poor stand-in for the real thing. They're just like, whether it's the best tabletop war game ever designed or the best TDG, it's not the real thing. It's an approximation. It's a simulation. With the DFC, I encourage people to provide only that information which was available, so far as we can determine, to the protagonist, right? To the person in whose shoes we've placed the student. For that reason, I prefer to do cases on more modern events, right? You could do a case on the Battle of Marathon, right? And I have a buddy of mine, Major Dennis Dunbar, did a case on the Battle of Marathon, phenomenal case, great for teaching tactics. But we can't go back and talk to the Persians and talk to the Greek commanders and say, what was going on in your head when this happened? But if I do a case on Sergeant Nick Galvan, I can ring him up, because a friend of mine, I can ring him up and say, hey, Nick, when you guys were reacting to that ambush, what were some of the considerations you were concerned about? So that's kind of my advice is provide only that which was available at the time and no more. Don't tell them how it ends. Don't give away any spoilers. Don't let the cat out of the bag, so to speak. And for students, I mean, it's in the name of the exercise, decision forcing exercises. Force them to make decisions in the face of uncertainty so that they get comfortable making decisions without all the information available. Let's see. Just looking for the next question. Lots of great comments. This has been great fun, guys. Do you see a use for computer-based war games in place of observed BogSat for training? 100%. I haven't talked much about digital games except for, if you recall the beginning of the talk, I'm a huge fan of digital games. I think, though, that with technology, it's easy for people to focus too much on the tech and to lose sight of what's the purpose of the game. I see a lot of games being used to validate concepts or to prove concepts, which I think is certainly useful, but I'm always concerned about that. I'm firmly kind of, I wouldn't say stuck, but firmly in favor of using games as educational tools, as training tools. I think digital games would be great for that. Again, I mean, for recruiting purposes, I would love for some local Marine recruiting station to host a game of StarCraft, or host a game of even Red Alert 2, or whatever's the latest real-time strategy. But do it in such a way, the game has to be facilitated, right? It's not playing. You could even, I mean, I've had enough arguments with people, and I've discussed this quite a bit with Sean McCann. We I think are of the opinion or the stance that you could use a game like Call of Duty or some of these other first-person shooters, if properly facilitated, to get at some of these things that we're trying to reach with typical decision games. And I also see there's a bunch of stuff down here. So yes, bottom line is absolutely in favor of digital decision or war games, commercial off the shelf. I'm all about. When working with military institutions, are you looking for the application of doctrinal military techniques, or are you looking for the creative out-of-the-box thinking? So this is a great question. So working with the Marine Corps, they've got this doctrine, this warfighting philosophy of maneuver warfare, which by its nature encourages creative, or at least should, creative out-of-the-box thinking. So I never steer participants to any particular course of action. I let them come up with I'll let them come up with what they come up with. And by and large, the students, this certainly happened at the basic school, the students self-police. The students will say, that's a cockamamie idea. That would never work. And here's why. And I let them fight it out. My job is to pour fuel on the fire and to ask open-ended questions that get people to challenge their assumptions, to break consensus. If everybody says, yeah, we should go left, I go, I don't know. That, the intel brief said there's a whole lot of machine gun positions up that path. Do you want to do that? And I'll try to get them to question themselves. I think part of the beauty of decision games is they test character. They can be used to test character. So I think this is part, and I'm sorry to keep, coming back to this, but I think because of working with people like, learning from people like Eric and Bruce and others, I try to avoid templates. I try to avoid canned solutions and stereotyped actions. I want to encourage people to break the mold and do whatever the situation requires. If that requires a whole hell of a lot of putting standoff between you and the enemy and just blasting the hell out of them, because that's what's most appropriate, then do that. If it's we're gonna drop most of our gear and infiltrate at night and collapse the enemy's position from the inside out, well, let's do that. That's usually what I encourage. Question here, Damien, do you have a copy of the old CCMM, that's Close Combat Marine? I do, big fan of it. And I think we've got Paul Nichols on here with us. Yeah, hey Paul, I see it. Yeah. So if you've not heard of Close Combat Marine, great program. It took Close Combat, and Paul can talk about it in more detail than I can, but it took Close Combat and then it put it in a Marine context. And Brendan McBreen, Paul Nichols were involved in this effort to, I think, spread digital wargaming throughout the Marine Corps. They even had a copy, this is how I found out about it, a copy of the game in the Marine Corps Gazette, which is, to me, that's unheard of. I don't think the Marine Corps Gazette has ever done that, where they had a game. Yep, that's the issue. Perfect. Paul and Brendan, I think, did God's work there. I think what happened is the global war on terrorism, and people went to war, and it got lost in the shuffle. What I find ironic is it got lost in the shuffle. I think because of those wars, Iraq, Afghanistan, wargaming had an opportunity to flourish, and people they got busy with their pre-deployment training plans. They got busy with getting ready for the next fight. I think they missed the opportunity to use things like Close Combat Marines as a means to prepare for the next fight. That's my opinion. Take it for what it's worth, but thank you, Paul, for bringing that up. You can Google it. I think it lives on. I think Close Combat Marine lives on in the tactical decision kits that have been fielded to all the infantry battalions. As I understand it, the tactical decision kit, TDK for short, I think it's being used in places and not used in others. I'd love to see the TDKs employed more. I'd love people to see and use the full suite of games that are involved in the TDK, but I think time will tell. Yeah, and Pascal, I agree with you. You said, in my honest opinion, creativity and out-of-the-box thinking might get even more crucial, especially in the time of advanced machine learning, in order to prevent being predictable to the enemy. I couldn't agree more. I think we need less of that and less of, or more of that and less of canned, stereotyped solutions. The lava monster, yeah, that's right.
So to inject right here, as we're about to reach the end of our time, I do want to add a small caveat to our discussion here today. Personally, I'm a big advocate of educational games and using gaming as a method of education and training. Obviously, I teach at Georgetown on wargame design, But should be, remember for the crowd, especially for those who are new to the field, that there is a distinction between games designed for analysis and games designed for education. The bar is lower for education because you can, in terms of games you can use in terms of using COTS, commercial off-the-shelf games, or other games that have less research or analytical models built into them. But there should be a remembrance that they can't be often swapped between the two categories. So a game that's maybe used for education and has lots of utility in that department may not be great for using a game for, let's say, your dissertation or a research project or analysis for a think tank. So that's my one caveat that I wanted to remind everyone about. And for more of these webinars we will be having in the upcoming summer, please tune into our newsletter, sign up on our website. Our next speaker, I believe, will be Rex Bryan, who'll be giving a talk about gaming the non-kinetic. And we also have a great panel that has Becker Wasser, Phil Pornell, Taylor Tieford, and Jeremy Sapinski, who are all accomplished gamers in their own field from all sorts of areas, who will be talking on a career panel about how to start a career in wargaming. So please come back again virtually, and hope you enjoyed our conversation. Please thank our amazing speaker, Damien, for giving us 2 hours of his precious time on a Monday. Thank you all. Have a great evening. Stay safe and stay healthy out there.
Thank you, everybody. Have a good night.